Hello, my name's Kate Innes. I'm a writer based near Much Wenlock. In 2018, I was asked to collaborate with the Bayston Hill Reading Group to write a short story. It was such a pleasure doing this. The group gave me lots and lots of ideas to include in my story, and one of the most influential was the idea that it might be set in or around a haberdasher's shop. And almost immediately I knew that it would be set during World War II. So I went to the Shrewsbury Archive and I did a bit of research, especially in the year 1940, what was happening in Shrewsbury and the surrounding area. So I've actually used some real events in the making of the story, as well as quite a few fictional characters. I hope you enjoy it. None the Worse by Kate Innes. By the time Rose had reached the edge of town, her hair was flying around her head, the useless pins on the point of falling out. It had seemed so warm when she'd finished the milking, but now the wind was driving hard across the Severn, and the small fallen leaves were gusting into piles under hedges peppered with sloes and berries. It was autumn again, and she should have worn her hat. 1 whole year since the invasion of Poland. A whole year of war and no victories, Albert had complained in his last letter. Except one. The day exactly a year ago, when he'd come to the farm on his bicycle in the early evening, knowing her father would be out. The weather had been fine, the air full of the smell of cut straw. He'd whistled as he pedalled them to the mere, with her on the back holding on to his shirt. She'd been dumbstruck, still shocked that he, the most handsome of all the young men she knew, wanted to be with her. She'd sat listening to him beside the bottomless pool, under the silver birches, and trembled inside, her fingers and lips stained with the blackberries he'd picked on the way. Albert had been very excited by the news of invasion. He'd talked for a long time about his experience with guns and his excellent aim. A donkey pulling a cart loaded with parcels crossed the road in front of her, heading towards the market. The sight of the brown cardboard and string sent an electric shock up Rose's arm. She clutched her bag, feeling for her gas mask. The previous week, she'd left it behind and had spent a whole day in fear of the ARP warden on the bridge, who was an old bugger and never smiled. He'd fine you as soon as look at you. She would have to hurry to reach the shop by 8:30, when Mrs. Knight would be pulling back the curtains. Mrs. Knight was never late, as she lived alone in the flat above the shop. But if Rose arrived panting and dishevelled, she was not scolded. Mrs. Knight was her father's cousin. She made allowances. However, this morning the curtains were closed and the red door was locked. Rose knocked sharply, glancing up at the first floor window. It was still blacked out, and there was no answer. Rose looked up and down the street. In the distance she could hear the cries of cartmen and the harsh noise of an engine coughing on too little fuel. But Rouse Hill was empty. Even Mrs. Bligh at the cobbler's shop, who spent at least half her life standing on the corner looking for her many wayward children, was absent. There had been no signs of bomb damage on the way in, but the town was certainly subdued. Rose began to pin her loose hair back in place by the dim reflection in the shop window. She looked old, her hair lank and dull. 1 year since that day by the mere, and her face was already drawn like her mother's had been before she died. Hard work and worry had taken what she'd had of beauty before she'd even reached 18. And secrets did it worst of all. "Stop staring at yourself. Look sharp and help me with this lot." Rose dropped her hands from her face and turned. Mrs. Knight was standing just behind her, her cheeks and eyes red. In her arms there was a large towel wrapped and tied into a bundle. "Don't gulp like a trout. Hold out your hands, girl." Mrs. Knight dropped the heavy bundle into her outstretched arms and fished in her bag for the shop key. Her swollen fingers were trembling as she pushed it into the keyhole. Inside was full of the scent of lavender and dyed cloth. Mrs. Knight pulled back the curtains with force. Light flooded the displays of ribbons and trim, the baby clothes, and the bolts of cloth, thick blackout and tweed behind, expensive coloured silks at the front. "Take those out the back," Mrs. Knight said, closing the door. "They need a good wash." Rose put the bundle on the old scrub table in the washroom and untied it, wrinkling her nose at the smell of plaster and mortar. It was full of women's and children's clothes, all heaped and tangled together. Rose lifted a child's cardigan with tiny pink buttons out of the jumble, and the hairs stood up on the back of her neck. "Just leave them there and come back with the mop. There'll be dust in the air after last night, and I don't want it marking silk," Mrs. Knight called. Rose laid the cardigan on top of the pile and went to fill the bucket. She usually slept soundly after her long hours of work, but the explosions last night had woken even her. There'd been a few in August, bombers dropping their loads before flying back down the moonlit line of the Severn. Shrewsbury was a bullseye in the river's curve, and it was a miracle that the town had escaped the destruction so far. That was what the vicar had said last month. "No miracles for Liverpool or London," her father had muttered as they came out of the church. "It's nothing to do with God. It's having no factories." Rose set the bucket down and rested the mop against the door frame. "Where are those clothes from?" Mrs. Knight shook her head. She was sitting in the chair behind the high counter where she did her fine work in the light from the window. But today that light was turning her face the colour of white ash. "I can't speak of it yet. Make me a cup of tea upstairs, Rose, and make sure it's good and strong." When Rose came back downstairs with the tray, Mrs. Knight's eyes were shut and the shop door was still locked. "Tea, Mrs. Knight," Rose said, carefully placing the tray on the counter. The older woman opened her eyes and sat forward a little. Rose poured the milk and held the strainer ready. "I've had no sleep, Rose, so you're going to have to pull your socks up today and manage as best you can. Don't look like that. You're perfectly capable if you stop daydreaming." Mrs. Knight stared at Rose's hand as she passed the teacup. "That should not be out in public." Rose looked down and saw the thin silver band on her ring finger that Albert had insisted she wear. A cheap, plain thing, without even a fake gem to make it pretty. She'd taken off her gloves to make the tea and had forgotten to hide the ring in the inner pocket of her coat. She twisted it off her hand and gripped it in her fist. "I'm sorry." Rose felt her throat closing over the words. All these months, Mrs. Knight had said nothing to her father about Albert, but now her face was angry, her lips pressed thin. "I promise it won't happen again." Mrs. Knight straightened her back. "You've no need to apologize to me, Rose, but if you don't do the sensible thing very soon, you will indeed be sorry." Mrs. Knight crossed her arms over her chest and drew a deep breath. "I went along with it at first," she said, shaking her head. "Thought it was right. I know how difficult your father is, and he's even worse since your mother passed, God rest her. I knew he wouldn't want to let you go and then have to pay someone to do the farm work." The older woman looked up at Rose fiercely. "But I've had my eye on you, and now this has to stop. That lad is not to write to you here at my shop any more." Rose looked down, tears pooling in her eyes. Mrs. Knight took a deliberate sip of tea and leant forward. "I've read those letters, you know." She pointed to the drawer below the counter where they were hidden. "Nothing but bragging about how many he has killed and complaining about everything else. Not a thought for you, except to order you to send him a portrait photo so he can boast to his battalion." She tapped her fingernail on the counter. "Now look at me, Rosie. I know you're a loyal girl, but you are too meek. You need to stand up for yourself. Albert doesn't deserve your loyalty. He does not love you." She stabbed the counter with each word. "And as for you, young lady, you may try to pretend, but I can tell you don't love him either. You barely even read his letters." Rose closed her eyes, feeling the hard edge of the silver in her fist, seeing the silver birches that had stood indifferently over her a year before, when Albert's hand had crushed her mouth so that she could not scream as he twisted her arm behind her back and pushed her down. Afterwards, he had told her to fix her hair and said nothing else all the long ride back to the farm where he'd left her. Father was still at the pub. He did not see her washing in bucket after bucket of cold water. For 2 whole days and nights she'd waited, sick and terrified. Then on the Monday morning, Albert had appeared in the milking parlour doorway at first light and pushed the ring onto her finger. Speaking of the future as if it were an ox he'd decided to buy, already acting the soldier, with a jaunty walk off to HQ to join up. After he'd left, Rose had felt some comfort that if there was to be a baby, there would at least be a father. When it was clear there was no baby, she'd hidden the ring inside the torn fabric of her mattress and tried to forget. Then the letters from France began to arrive. Albert shooting a young German soldier in the chest. Albert wounded but still able to march 40 miles. Albert surviving again and again, even when his battalion was cut off from Dunkirk. He'd escaped on an old gunboat and was back in Blighty safe and sound. Clever Albert. Lucky Albert. Very soon he would get leave. Very soon he would be back. Rose had both her hands over her mouth, trying to stifle her sobs. Mrs. Knight put down her cup, reached over, and touched her arm. "What happened, Rosie?" Mrs. Knight clutched her and gave her a little shake. "Rose, did that lad force you?" Rose nodded into her wet hands. Mrs. Knight closed her eyes and sighed. She reached for the tray and spooned sugar into a cup. In the quiet, the girl's sobbing began to subside. "You aren't the first, Rosie, not by a long road." Mrs. Knight poured the tea and stirred. "And won't be the last either." The older woman's face crumpled. "But you should have told me, you silly girl." I would have helped you." Rose found her handkerchief in her pocket. "Please don't tell Father," she whispered, wiping her face. Mrs. Knight sighed again, this time with exasperation. "As if I would," she sniffed, dabbing her eyes briskly. "Now bring that stool here and sit down." Mrs. Knight pushed the cup towards Rose and folded her hands. She watched the girl drink. "I'll tell you where those clothes came from, Rose." She looked towards the window, as if listening to a distant sound. "Do you remember Mrs. Povey that lives up Ellesmere Road, who came in here last week with her girls?" "I know her," Rose said, her voice husky, broken. "A bomb fell on their cottage last night and killed her and all those sweet children." Mrs. Knight's chest shuddered, but she clasped her hands together and continued. "Yet John Povey came out of that wrecked building without a scratch. And I tell you, even with his wife and children gone and his house destroyed, that man still thought to pass on their clothes to the evacuees before the house was demolished." She wagged her finger at Rose. "So, my girl, you best pull yourself together. There are lots of good men. They're not all handsome, but you'll know them easily enough. They're the ones who look out for the weak, not take advantage of them." Rose placed the ring on the counter. It stared at her like a disembodied eye. She hid it under her palm. "He said he'd take me away from all that farm work," she whispered. Mrs. Knight snorted. "There's worse things than hard work, my girl. Worse things than a hard, bloody-minded father, too. Besides, where's that lad going to take you? That tiny house in Sharpstone Lane where his mother slaves over other people's washing? No. He's got his hook into you, but we can take it out, and you'll be none the worse for it." Mrs. Knight squinted at her with her dark eyes, two deep grooves running down the centre of her forehead. There was a knock on the door. "Go and get it, Rose. It's probably Mrs. Gibb wanting her finished blouse." But it was the old postman waiting on the pavement. Rose's heart began to hammer in her chest. "Nothing for you today," he lisped with his nearly toothless gums. "Just this for Mrs. Knight." He thrust a parcel at her and winked a yellow eye. "Pretty girl like you shouldn't be sad. That lad of yours will write soon." Rose stared at his grinning face. A fissure of hot rage seemed to be pushing her out of her own body and up into the morning air. It was as if she were an aeroplane, ready to press the release button. "Wait here, I have something for you," she ordered, and turned on her heel, leaving him on the doorstep. Rose abandoned the parcel on the counter and opened a drawer. She took out the packet of letters, thumbing through them until she found Albert's photograph. Holding it between her finger and her thumb, she opened another drawer and took out an embroidery needle. "One of your special envelopes, please, Mrs. Knight," she said, not looking up. With one hand she held the picture of Albert in his uniform, and with the other she stuck the needle through his forehead. She forced the needle further in, then pushed it back up through his nose. It protruded like a long animal horn. A bubble of laughter escaped from her open mouth. Her other hand found the silver ring and hung it on the needle. Then she bent the photograph and shoved the sharp point into his neck, trapping the ring on his smirking face. Mrs. Knight was standing near her, holding out a strong brown envelope. Rose took it, shoved the pierced photograph inside, and licked and closed the flap. "I have a stamp," said Mrs. Knight's voice from a long way away. Rose took the shot pen, and in her neat hand, the one thing her father praised her for, wrote out Albert's name for the last time. The end.